For more than 65,000 years, Aboriginal Australians lived across this entire continent. They existed as hundreds of sovereign nations, speaking over 250 different languages. Under the law of the dreaming, country functions as a living relative, an inseparable mix of identity, kinship, and ancestral law. This spiritual bond meant land was held in trust for future generations, rather than being treated as property to be individually owned or sold. This worldview dictated precise land management. Through controlled fire regimes and seasonal harvesting, communities maintained an ecological balance that allowed them to thrive across diverse environments for 60 millennia. This was a perfectly calibrated, continent-wide civilization. The arrival of the British Navy brought a sudden, violent severance of those ancient connections, throwing the existing sovereign order into immediate turmoil. In 1788, the British established their first penal colony at Sydney Cove. To justify the occupation, they invoked the legal doctrine of terra nullius, claiming the land belonged to no one. Colonial records like this map prove that claim false, recording specific boundaries of clans like the Gadigal and Wangal. As settlements pushed outward, agriculture disrupted the balance. Livestock fouled ancestral water sources, and settlers depleted the fish and game clans relied on. Beyond the physical displacement, European diseases proved catastrophic. In 1789, just 1 year after the first fleet arrived, a smallpox epidemic killed roughly 70% of the indigenous population around the Sydney area. Within a single generation, the foundational pillars of Aboriginal life, legal standing, physical health, and the land itself, faced a coordinated effort to erase them. The common historical myth of a peaceful settlement ignores the reality of the frontier wars, a series of violent, protracted conflicts that followed colonial expansion across the continent. After the initial shock of arrival, Indigenous communities shifted to organized warfare. They fought tactically to protect their waterholes, hunting grounds, and sacred sites from encroachment. Leaders like Pemulwuy and Jandamara used their knowledge of the land to conduct guerrilla raids against settlers and colonial outposts. Jandamara, for example, led a 2-year campaign in the Kimberley that repeatedly evaded police and ranchers. The colonial response was characterized by systemic violence. Documented massacres at places like Mile Creek and the brutal displacement campaigns of Tasmania's Black War were used to crush resistance and clear the land for sheep and cattle. Rather than a passive tragedy, this era was a deliberate, sovereign defense of country that forced the British Empire into a bloody military conflict lasting over a century. By the late 19th century, the strategy shifted from military force to bureaucratic control. New protection acts allowed governments to confine survivors to missions and reserves, strictly regulating every aspect of their lives. This control peaked with the stolen generations. Between 1910 and 1970, tens of thousands of Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families to be raised in white institutions or foster homes. These policies were designed to enforce assimilation. By forbidding children from speaking their native languages or learning their lore, the government intended to make Aboriginal culture vanish from the Australian landscape. Yet, culture went underground. Within the missions, elders maintained kinship ties in secret, whispering languages and practicing ceremonies away from the eyes of colonial authorities. In an environment designed for total erasure, the simple act of preserving a songline or remembering a family connection was a calculated act of resistance. The decades spent protecting culture in secret created a network of survivors who understood the colonial system from the inside. By the 20th century, they began using the English literacy and legal knowledge they had been forced to learn as weapons for political confrontation. This political resistance went public in 1938. On the 150th anniversary of colonization, Aboriginal activists held a national day of mourning protest to demand equality and citizenship rights. This momentum eventually forced the recognition of land rights. In 1966, the Gurindji People's Wave Hill Walk-Off led to this landmark handover of soil, marking the first time the government officially returned land based on Indigenous ancestral ties. The weapons had changed from spears to national strikes and legal petitions, but the core demand remained the same: the recognition of sovereignty and the right to country. The legacy of this dispossession is visible in modern data. Today, Indigenous life expectancy is 8 to 9 years lower than for non-Indigenous Australians, and incarceration rates are roughly 14 times higher. Addressing these outcomes requires institutional honesty. The 2008 National Apology to the Stolen Generations served as a formal admission by the Australian Parliament that past state-sanctioned policies were wrong and caused lasting harm. Today, the push for treaties and constitutional recognition continues. At the same time, communities are revitalizing their languages and ceremonies, turning survival into a vibrant cultural reclamation. Despite over 2 centuries of efforts to erase their presence, Aboriginal Australians remain the world's oldest continuous civilization, still adapting, still defending their rights, and inextricably tied to country.